Your Honor.
1066. Does anybody know what happened in the year 1066?
Yes.
The Battle of Hastings.
The Battle of Hastings. That's yeah.
I live in the UK.
Yeah,
You have to
exactly.
know that to get an entry.
So the Battle
Last
of
time the
Hastings.
UK was invaded.
No. The Battle of Hastings happened in 1066, which involved Duke William of Normandy invading the southern coast of England and engaging with the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Hastings. Not the Scots, I might add, as a Scot, but the Anglo-Saxons got beat that day, and then William took over the country. So the other thing that happened in 1066 was that William decided to make a list of everything he owned in his new country, in his new kingdom. And he sent emissaries throughout the land to make lists of everything. In other words, to create a database. And because of the way things were at the time, the value was in the countryside, land, animals, estates, not in the cities. So they said at the time, let's not do Greater London. We're going to go where the money is. We'll get back to that later, right? We'll do London later. Well, you can go to the Doomsday Book in the British Museum. It's called the Doomsday Book, this database. And you will notice that the Greater London still, for some reason, is not included in the Doomsday Book. So they went off and did the valuable thing first, saying, we'll get around to this other stuff later, what you might call the long tail, right? So this should start to sound familiar if you deal in metadata in the present day. So with that in mind, why don't we introduce the panel? Because we're going to discuss how much metadata and databases have evolved, if at all, since 1066. Abby, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Hello, my name is Abby North. Company is called North Music Group, and now I'm going to call my database the Doomsday Book. So I do music rights management, music publishing, also some sound recording distribution and creation, but also have built some technology, some tools for royalty processing, royalty tracking, and works registration.
Hi, I'm Richard Burgess. I'm the President and CEO of the American Association of Independent Music, A2IM, and my background is as an artist, songwriter, musician, producer. I've done pretty much everything you can do in the music industry for my sins.
Hi, my name is Helienne Lindvall. I'm a songwriter. I'm also a columnist. I had a column for The Guardian about working as a music creator. I'm also the president of the European Composer and Songwriter Alliance. And my background, I have worked with some metadata companies like Audley and Viva Sound Consulting. Just to kind of, for me, I always say, it feels like once I started looking into metadata, I'm probably, as a songwriter, I'm such a nerd when it comes to metadata, because I felt like I'd opened the hood of a car and there was no engine in there, just a bunch of cables hanging out. And I felt like I knew how to put an engine in and kind of like put those cables in. I feel like I've worked on the credits due thing that Graham talked about earlier, and the fixed streaming, and I'm on the metadata working group that we have in the UK that the government kind of instigated, and the Intellectual Property Office. And I feel like we're getting somewhere, but there's still so many issues, in particular when it comes to songwriters and publishing.
Hi, everybody. I'm Anjula Singh. I'm the CFO and COO at SoundExchange. At SoundExchange, we provide products and services to over 700,000 global creators worldwide, enable our digital service providers to meet their obligations, and we fight for our creators to get their fair share of their compensation.
Well, great. So we have an august panel here of experts. And Helienne, let's start with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what sort of the core identifiers are, which we'll call the IPI, the ISRC, and the ISWC. What are those, and why are they important?
Well, like IPI, the Interested Party Identifier, which I would say is only because I'm such a nerd that I know that. A lot of people would know it as a CAE originally, as the identifier for the composer and songwriter and for the publisher. The ISRC is the identification of the recording, and the ISWC, the W is because it's the identification of the work, which is the song in itself.
So it's the International Standard Recording Code and the International Standard Musical Works Code. Now, do you find those are being well used, or are they used in tandem, consistently with each other, or are some missing?
There are a lot of them missing. And I will agree with what Graham was saying, too, that it's on every level that people are not kind of reporting correctly. I take responsibility as a songwriter and my co-writers that it's very rare that we get all that information right from the start. I compare it to, showing somebody a prenup on the first date. You don't want to talk about splits. You don't want to talk about the kind of admin. You just want to make a great song and open up a couple of beers and then walk into the sunset. And then you'll never see those people again. And then what happens is, some of those songwriters might go to their publisher and say, oh, I did this song with DJ Dave. Who's DJ Dave? I don't know, DJ Dave. You can't put that down, and it's already at that point that you're having some issues. And then, the connection between the ISRC and ISWC, of course. And then not everybody uses the ISWC. I mean, most organizations use it, but like the MLC is not a standard for the MLC, for example, which I see as an issue. And then, there's also the IPN that is not on that list.
Tell us about that.
I'm trying to remember.
International Performer Number.
Oh, yeah, International Performer Number, which is the musicians that are performing on the track that have that, and that is even less known, even by musicians, what that is, and not definitely that is not used everywhere.
So, Anjula, when you do this, let's say somebody gives you a pile of royalties, right? And you're sort of like the person who fell to earth, and you don't really know anything about where it came from. How do you start unraveling that? Like let's say one of your licensees sends you $100,000, and they send you some kind of report, I guess, along with that. What's the minimum that you would have to have in that report in order to be able to administer those monies and make sure they get paid to the right people?
Well, there are a lot of different components. So first, the minimum just that you would need, obviously, is title, song version, the metadata of the song. You need to know where it was played, the usage. So let me just step back and frame it a little bit differently. There's a couple different areas that we need to think about. Volumes. SoundExchange pays out about $1 billion a year, maybe about 11 billion since its inception. So we're not talking small scale. So we have to have systems in place that can handle these large transactional volumes that come through. So you already have that in one court you have to deal with. You have to understand all the rights owners and who's on what song, when it's been exchanged or played and sold to different people, who had it when. With the digital service providers, what did they play? When did they play it? What version did they play? So you have a lot of the components of the metadata out in the universe. If you don't start out with the first, at inception, with the right data there, you're at a loss already before you get started.
So if you had, with SoundExchange, you administer a compulsory license, which basically means anybody who qualifies, let's say, but essentially anybody, can take advantage of that license and rely on that license. Then they have accounting obligations where they have to pay you and they have to report to you. Are those obligations established by regulation, and are they required to give you a certain format, or can they send it in? I mean, could they give you a Word document? Can it be an Excel spreadsheet, or is there some interface you have on your website, or how does that all work?
So with our requirements with our regulation, there's a minimum set of fields that are required to be given, and there's a format to be given to us. You don't necessarily have to have the ISRC, but it's important to have it. But you need the title, the track, the version, those types of things. We take that. What we've also done, because we felt what was important to do, was to source the rights owners on those tracks straight from the rights owner. So whose song is this? Whose track is this? We get continuous feeds from the rights owners, and then we also have the artists let us know their what songs they've been on and that type of stuff. So we have that process where we're knowing from the authoritative source the data. The digital service providers have a requirement of a minimum number of fields that they have to present to us. We'll then do a matching exercise of that data. We may have the ISRC because we have the rights owner and the version and title. We'll do a matching to the title and the fields that have been presented by the DSP. But early on in our view of this, we realized that another benefit we could provide was to send back when the digital service providers were sending us their usage reports, we pre-populate the ISRC to the extent we can and send it back so that we can promote the proper use of the data in the ecosystem. And that's helped us over the years to continue to promote that.
And so does that mean that if let's say SiriusXM pays you on the same version of Honky Tonk Women by the Rolling Stones, over a 5-year period, that every time they report it to you, it comes across with the same or better metadata than it had the last time?
You would hope so, but if it doesn't, we have matching algorithms that can help us normalize that.
Right.
And then match it to the rights owner so that we can get that paid out properly.
So you're kind of always at the mercy of the service to a certain extent, right?
We are, but we have, perfected this, I guess, as best as one can say. For the $1 that comes in the month, 91 cents of that can go out the door within the first payment of that. Okay. So we have found a way to at least get 91% of that usage reported to us out the door within 45 days. That tells us that we have accuracy on what's being paid, but both with a combination of working with the digital service providers, but also with the rights owners to continuously try to get the metadata correct at the beginning.
Right. So, Abby, on the song side, the Music Modernization Act set up the MLC, right, in the Mechanical Licensing Collective. So just so everybody gets this, the Mechanical Licensing Collective is the first United States mechanical royalty collecting society that administers on behalf of the whole industry. I think it's fair to say most other countries have had this for a while. I think they're called authors' rights societies outside the United States, if I'm not mistaken.
The MCPS just turned 100, so it's been quite a while.
Yes. But we didn't have one until 2021. But it was established by law in 2018. And so at that point, before that, we had the Harry Fox Agency was probably the closest thing to a mechanical collecting society that we had. So what we were told when the Music Modernization Act, Title I, as Graham noted, which because there's 3 sections, they deal with different things. So Title I is where all the MLC stuff is. When that was established, somehow they had to populate the database in order to begin rendering statements, and they had a couple years to get that together. So Abby, when they decided when they were required to create that database. What was their, I don't want to be sarcastic and say strong move, but what was their move at that point to try to get up to speed and get working? Did they build it from scratch or did they hire somebody else?
So there is the Mechanical Licensing Collective, which is the thing created by the Music Modernization Act. Then there is the MLC Inc., which is the company that is acting as that MLC, Mechanical Licensing Collective, which was brand new. And then there, as you mentioned, was this maybe 100 years old, or 80, something like that, organization called Harry Fox Agency here in the United States. And for a very long time, for probably the most of its existence, Harry Fox Agency had been kind of an administrative agency working on behalf of music publishers who didn't have resources to one by one license mechanical rights. And so Harry Fox would do that for physical, for download, not at the physical, let's say physical, this is before download. And then they would collect and they would pay the publishers. Then streaming came along and we didn't have this blanket mechanical license that was created by the Music Modernization Act. Rather, the process was a one by one licensing method. You had, the services had to license each work individually. But they didn't have the resources for that. So they used Harry Fox or another company called Music Reports to be the administrator doing that licensing on their behalf. So then the MLC Inc. becomes the MLC and engages Harry Fox Agency to be its vendor, providing data and the database and all its related systems, I guess.
So to pause there for a moment, in other words, at that moment in time, they made a conscious choice to not build a new database, but to instead engage the people who had been around for 100 years to
That is my understanding.
perpetuate the database that they
Correct.
had already constructed, because there was some idea that this would get them, this would be a more speedy result? Is that the
Speedier.
idea?
Yeah, I think, I mean, and to be fair, the other thing that I think could have stymied the MLC is the fact that it had to launch during the pandemic. So that did present challenges, and that could be another reason why an existing database could be valuable.
As opposed to extending the launch date till after a global pandemic was over, which was an option, I guess.
Or
But-
maybe creating a pod with a bunch of developers.
So, I mean, now we've been at this for a while. The MLC has been up and running for, several years now. They're in the middle of their review. And I know this is kind of like high level, but do you think that we're better off today than we were, say, 5 years ago, to coin a phrase? I mean, do you think that it's been an improvement?
So I do believe that having a blanket license as opposed to that one by one licensing process is an improvement. It streamlines things. I think one of the things the Mechanical Licensing Collective has done is made its bulk data available. And so for somebody that has resources to build technology to be able to utilize that data, we do have some visibility into ISRCs that are in that database, IPIs and ISWCs, or lack thereof. So are we better off? In many ways, I think it's a more efficient system. I think there are still many, many problems, issues, errors, gaps with the data, and that creates a tremendous workload for rights managers, for publishers,
Not at the MLC. Creates a tremendous workload for
for
you.
the publishers, for
Right.
the rights managers, because there is a need to still fix errors and gaps in data, and also do some royalty tracking on behalf of our writers.
So you're basically fixing the MLC's data gaps?
That is, yes. But again, to
And
be
they
fair.
cut you a check for that, right? For that
Well,
time
I
that
mean,
you
yes,
spend?
they cut me a very large check for that. No, they do not cut me a check for that. But to be fair, we do have to clean up data everywhere.
Right.
So at every collective management organization. This one is a new one, and it started with a data set that had been known to have gaps and errors.
So, Richard, without mentioning any names, there seems to be a lot of activity lately with various types of streaming fraud that includes pretty obviously incorrect artist names that are on tracks that are really the original recording, and people getting access to digital services to distribute recordings that are not their own, right? And there's some litigation about that now, and there's a streaming fraud case about that now. And what do you, I mean, on a certain level, you look at this and you say, well, I say, anyway, the real question we have to deal with here is, are we going to permit DIY artists or people who are saying they're DIY artists to have access to the retail stores? I mean, the streaming services, right? Because somehow these fraudulent tracks are getting through, and what I believe is no one's really checking very hard. So what's your experience with this, and what are your thoughts on can we continue to allow these DIY distributors to just have kind of free access to the pipe, as it were?
Thank you. It's a very complicated question because on the one hand, I think that DIY has been a really amazing thing for the average up-and-coming artist and writer insofar as, you don't have the gatekeepers between you and a record deal. So when I was a kid starting out, I had to persuade an A&R person at a record label to sign me, and then they had to put up the money. I had to make the record. Consequently, wound up signed to 6 major labels, one of them twice, when there were 5. And, it worked for me, but it didn't work for everybody. Not everybody could traverse their way through that system. And so the democratization of digital and the DIY services, I think, has been really a huge benefit. Unfortunately, along with the freedom comes the freedom to cheat. And I think one of 2 things happens. You wind up with a young writer maybe, or a young producer, or a young aspiring musician that doesn't really understand how copyright works. And so they wind up, taking a track that somebody else is and speeding it up and thinking that that's legitimate, especially if they're adding something to it. So I think there are genuine kind of, accidental, if you like, or transgressions that occur because people don't really understand how the system works and how copyright should be observed. On the other hand, we have pretty strong evidence that a lot of what's going on now is effectively criminal behavior. It's criminal gangs that are taking advantage of the system and extracting huge amounts of money out of the system that would normally go to people sitting up here and legitimate artists. And the way the streaming system works, all the money goes into a pool. So anybody who's extracting money out of that pool reduces the amount of money that goes to the people who are making legitimate recordings. Interestingly, I spoke to the founder of one of the largest independent labels not a while back, who was really bent out of shape about the DIY services and feels like they're ruining the industry. And I said to him, so tell me the last time one of your A&R people signed an act from going to a live gig and seeing the band, and he couldn't give me an example. So I think that DIY is a reality. It's the way people get started. It's the way they get record deals. Most of the artists that are, have come up in the last 10 years have come up through the DIY system. So I personally think that as difficult as it is what's going on, I think we have to make that system work. And so the question is not so much to me whether DIY is good or bad, it's how do we make it so that it can't be taken advantage of by people who are bad actors in particular, and then how do we make sure that, musicians who don't really understand copyright can be made to understand it. I keep hearing people say, "Oh, we've got to educate people." I go, "Well, good luck with that, because there's a 14-year-old kid right now that's messing around on his mother's computer, or probably his own computer at this point, and how do you get to that person? How do you find them? It's not like our system. It's not like the music industry is a very formalized system, and so the answer really is that you have to have a sort of a gatekeeping mechanism that vets everything that goes up on the streaming services, and the big debate is who should pay for that.
Yeah, and one of the things that we tried to do on one company I used to work with was we made it very difficult for people to get into the distribution chain illegitimately. It's like if you had if you wanted to be distributed through this company, you had to come forward and you had to give them your tax ID number, your driver's license number, and you'd have to show that you had released these same records at some point in the past. And if you didn't, in other words, if this was the absolute first time you had ever put out any record anywhere, right, then you'd have to talk to a human and convince that human that you were legit. But of course, you're more inclined to believe they're legit if they'll tell you where they live, they tell you, their mom's address or their address or wherever it is, and they give you their identification because you can check that out, tax ID number and so on, right? And then once they were in, we made it very easy to stay in. And so when I look at this, it seems to me that these distributors, which end up giving DIY for a kind of a bad name, are just simply not doing enough, to verify who they're letting in. It's not the artist's fault, the legitimate artist's fault, because at the end of the day, the DIY distributor gets a piece of either they get it prepaid, which to me is the most offensive, because they're forcing all the distribution risk onto the artist, or they're getting a fee off the top, and they don't really care if somebody's illegitimate, legitimate, whatever, at least until the marshals walk through the door with the handcuffs, because they're getting a commission off the top, and off the top is off the top. It's off of everybody. And to your point about the streaming royalty calculation, this is something I don't think people really necessarily understand. It's different. Like, for example, it's different than the compulsory license, right? So we'll talk about that. So the way the streaming pool works is the services like Spotify that are on-demand streams write a check for a pool of money, which is based on the deal they make with the individual labels, or in the case of the songwriters, it's based on the Copyright Royalty Board and direct deals. So when they do that, they put all the money into a pot. The services don't pay more or less if there's fraud in that pot. You could say maybe they're overpaying because there would be, maybe they'd be able to get out of paying for, public domain works or something like this. But by and large, they pay the same amount of money regardless, because it's a pool. It's how the pool's divided that becomes the problem with fraud. And so when these DIY companies or distributors allow just anybody to get into the system, the illegitimate tracks drag down the share that's available to the legitimate tracks, because if you're basically paying royalties based on what I would call a hyper-efficient market share distribution of that pool. you know? And so the more things that are, in the denominator, the smaller your share, the smaller your value of the numerator is going to be. So in other words, if you've got 100 tracks and you've got 10 of them, but that 100 tracks that's in the denominator really should be 80, you know, you'd have a bigger share of that pie, right? So it's a serious problem. But it all comes around to creating, it comes down to matching, like to be able to, because if you can match going in, you're going to, like when the tracks first enter the distribution chain, if you can determine right there that there's fraudulent tracks or insufficient data, then there's less likelihood that you would create what's called a black box at the other end. So in addition to the fraud, there's another problem, which is that when these tracks are not matched, there's a pile of money left over that has to be addressed in some way. So, Helienne, I know you've dealt a lot with this black box issue.
Yeah.
Can you just sort of tell people what that is and how it's created and how it's dealt with in different, I mean, in Europe, for example, it's different than it is here, but do you want to just address
so
that?
black box is unattributable income, basically. So where you know, I mean, it's such a multi-pronged kind of problem in the sense of just listening to what everyone was saying. There's so many things that I just feel need to be addressed. So I am part of again, through the fixed streaming campaign that we had that Graham talked about earlier, because I was on the IRS Academy board at the time. So when we launched this whole campaign that resulted in these working groups that were created by the Intellectual Property Office in the UK. And I would say that probably the metadata working group is actually one of the most successful initiatives of that. Transparency was not very, unsurprisingly. It took us months before we were even allowed to know who was on the transparency working group, which is quite ironic. And now the remuneration one is an uphill battle as well. But metadata, I think in the end, there is an incentive for all players to some degree. To address what you were saying about the independent distributors, they were like the last ones that we managed to get on board with this.
Really?
Yeah. Well, there was little interest. I think we had because we've worked together on the Credits Due thing as well. We called for, I think it was last year, we called in all like the TuneCores and the CD Babies to a meeting during Songwriters Week, and there was a discussion. And they're like, we want as little friction as possible, because we said, well, can't you have you can't go into a supermarket and buy an egg sandwich without knowing what's inside the egg sandwich. That's very regulated, but somehow you can release a record without any of the identifications of the song. The only thing you need, basically, even if you don't have an ISRC, they can create an ISRC for you. And I would say ISRCs are probably, of all those identifiers, the least regulated, and the ISWCs were almost too regulated, so it took too long to get one. But otherwise, no friction. It was more friction to get the right pixel on the picture than there was or still is when it comes to writer data.
So just to stop you here for a second. So when you hear a distributor say friction, right, what they mean is actually knowing what they're doing, right? Taking the time to actually make sure that this recording is what it says it is, this label is who they say they are, these artists are who they say they are, this certain writers and so on, right? They call that friction. They don't like friction because what they want to do is they want to get that track through the system and into a money-making position as soon as possible, and they don't frankly care, if it's right.
Yeah, but I think that that is actually changing, but to kind of have a little kind of, ray of light there.
Prison has a tendency to do that.
Yeah, and also, if you look at somebody or a company like TuneCore, which is now part of Believe and Centric, and both Believe and in particular Centric, which is a publishing company, they want metadata in there. So that kind of is raising the bar for TuneCore. So TuneCore came on board to kind of sit with us. I think also I was on a panel at Eurosonic in Europe last year, where there were independent distributors on there, and they were saying they had started to, when it came to fraud, to have a bad actors list, so that these fraudsters couldn't just go from independent distributor to the next one. And they said, at least, they said that in the end, it's not good for them to just have that, they want to clean up their act. Not all of them, clearly, because that's why we have that fraud thing, or the fraud case. And still 10% of all streaming is supposedly fraudulent. So it's a lot of money that is going out the door.
I'm hearing much higher numbers than 10%, by the way. We did a letter with the majors. I think it was with Kerry, right? Several years ago. And I think at the time we estimated around 4%. Not that long ago, we said 10%. But recently I'm hearing 20 to 40%. And then yesterday I was in a seminar where they were talking about certain aspects of, or certain distributors where the fraud is as high as 90%. So
90%?
90%, yeah.
U.S. distributors?
Yeah, I don't want to say, but it's alarmingly high. And I think the thing is, the bad actors, it's pretty difficult to get around that because, to your point, Chris, that, where you could identify the person uploading, that's impossible at the scale we're at now. And we've got 120,000 plus tracks a day being uploaded, and how do you verify? You can't have somebody sit there checking every picture ID. And not only that, but the bad actors are very clever. They've learned how to, stream hundreds of thousands of tracks or many tracks and keep them below the threshold where they really show up. But they're making $5 or so on each track, and that can add up to be $1 million a year or more. So, there are a lot of barriers.
I don't agree that you can't do it with 120 tracks, because I think that, for a lot of services, you do have to identify yourself to be able to use a service. More and more now, certainly over in Europe, it's like you have to have an identification to use apps or whatever, and you only need to do it once to be a client of that distributor, because obviously 120,000 tracks are rarely just like done.
I'm not saying you can't do it, by the way. I'm just saying that it can't be done manually. It has to be done in an automated way, and that's where you run into the problem, because the bad actors are pretty they're very savvy, and they know how to use bots, and you got to be one step ahead is the bottom line, and we're many steps behind. That's the problem.
One of the things you can do, or you used to be able to do anyway, I think you still can, is there's automated services where you may not be able to check, you may not be able to get a piece of information about somebody, but you can say, if I have this and this and this and this, the address, the tax ID number, the driver's license number, does that relate back to the same person? And that you can do on a pretty automated basis. So the point being, maybe the 120,000 tracks a day is the wrong number, right? Maybe what do we value, volume or accuracy? I think that's...
Well, that also goes to the fact that, like, Deezer just dumped, I think it was 28 million tracks off of their system, and they had 0 plays, which boggles my mind. How could any track ever have 0 plays? You'd assume that your mother would play it, or you would play it, or your brother, right? But they did, and that makes sense to me. I'm not a big fan of some of these new payment systems that some of the DSPs have put in place. But it seems to me, if you've got a track that hasn't streamed at all, or below a certain threshold, there's no reason to keep it on the system. But that still doesn't solve the problem. The bad actors are doing pretty well right now, and we got to get ahead of them.
Yeah,
we
they
have
don't
systems,
zero
though.
plays. They don't have, the bad actors don't have zero plays, unfortunately.
No.
But,
They don't, yeah.
Well, Anjula, when you have, at SoundExchange, you're dealing with a kind of a similar thing, I mean, in the sense that you've got a lot of distributors that can upload or can register with SoundExchange. And, I mean, how do you guys do it? I mean, you got to get a tax ID number, you got to get certain identifiers, right?
It's getting increasingly complicated, as everyone is explaining. You know, you have to give us your basic information, but we have had to put in place without going into too much detail, a lot of extra fraud steps that we have in place, whether it's checking on the banking side or on your documentation, but we also have, you know, algorithms and models that are pinning around location and just patterns to see if we have it, and we are detecting a fair bit of, you know, registrants that are fraudulent in that process.
Right.
On the usage side of stuff, we tend to see, we've been kind of putting a net around AI-generated content at the moment, to the extent we get that. We don't get the sound files, but we get the metadata. And so from that standpoint, we have seen most of the digital service providers that we work with are catching that, and it's not coming through to us that much.
So do you think your licensees are also engaging in fraud protection?
Very much so, yes.
Yeah. So they try to catch it before they make the payment?
For our side, yes, for what we're seeing. I mean, there's still stuff coming through, but not at the volumes that you're seeing outside of the non-interactive space.
So, Abby, what, in terms of, I don't want to make you the MLC maven here, but.
I'm a friend, not a foe.
Right, in terms of the black box payments from the MLC or to the MLC, what's the status of that? It seems like it's kind of hard to get a handle on
Well,
exactly
let's
what
talk
the
about what it
inflows and
was.
outflows.
So this was part of why the Music Modernization Act happened, was services wanted protection. They had all this money. They didn't know who to distribute to. And so MLC launches and services pass to the MLC something like $424 million in what's called black box, meaning unattributed, unallocated, undistributed, whatever you want to call it, royalties. And so the job of the MLC is, and was, to identify who the correct parties are who should be paid that money. That's what the black box is. It's unattributed, unallocated, undistributed, whatever you want to call it. There are a couple different ways to enter the black box now at the MLC. There's a musical work, a song, and that musical work has publishers. Those publishers have to join the MLC, and they have to either claim an existing kind of iteration of that metadata, of like somebody has delivered some kind of metadata about that work. Is it already in MLC's database? And generally it would have happened from Harry Fox agency. It would have been legacy data from there, and it may be incomplete or inaccurate. And so that's the first step the publisher does, is my work there? Second thing is, am I attributed? And if I'm attributed, is my share correct? If it doesn't exist at all yet, then the publisher has to register that work, and specifically that publisher's share of that work, right? So if there's been a recording that does not have 0 streams, but actually does have streams, that DSP has to know the embedded composition to know how to pay a mechanical. So first step is the claim, meaning the work itself. The second step is to look at the sound recordings that the DSPs have said have streams, and then make sure that that musical work is associated with that sound recording. So how do we do that? Because any mechanical society has to do this now. It's the exact same job anywhere in the world. You have to know the ISRC, the sound recording identifier. If they don't have it, that would be weird for a DSP not to have an ISRC at this point. If they didn't have it, I suppose you could look at a sound recording title and an artist, but let's rely on the ISRC, and you have to match that ISRC to what we've already explained as the universal, the globally unique identifier in the perfect world for the musical work, the ISWC. And everywhere in the world, the ISWC, CISAC is the parent entity of performance rights organizations around the world. CISAC is the entity that manages the allocation, distribution of the ISWC.
But the MLC is not a member of CISAC.
That's correct. And while the BWARM standard is the DDEX standard that the Mechanical Licensing Collective uses for data, and it does include a field for the ISWC, but historically, the Harry Fox Agency had the Harry Fox Song Code, which was the HFA song code, which was its internal proprietary identifier to identify a musical work. Every database, every collective management organization in the world has a proprietary identifier. They might call it a work code, they might, whatever it is. But they also, everybody but the MLC also uses the ISWC. And then we link the ISWC, the International Standard Work Code, to the IPI name number, the International Party Identifier. And that's how we create the association between the musical work, the publishers, the writers. So now, in a perfect world, this mechanical licensing collective and any mechanical collective in the world should have the ISRC associated with the ISWC, and then the IPN, the parties are known, the publishers are known, the songwriters are known. That's our blue sky perfect world.
Because now my nerd comes out. I think one of the things that there's two, like the two main issues that when it comes to metadata with EXA and as songwriters, are the lack of cooperation between CMOs. How they're all competing, and a lot of CMOs feel that their data is their value. So sharing data and matching data is not where it should be. And also, I mean, not having an ISW, not using ISWC is it's inexplicable to me. And that would be like the basic thing. We have a CMO working group at EXA because a lot of our members, songwriter members, sit on the boards of different CMOs across Europe. And we realized that a lot of CMOs, the reason we started it was because we realized a lot of CMOs are reinventing the wheel over and over again. And that's our royalty money that is being used on, copying other, different music tech companies doing the same thing instead of working across borders. And to me, I think the back office should be more collaborative.
Absolutely.
The front, when it comes to licensing, yes, that should be, you should compete in that, but not when it comes to the admin.
There's one other thing, I'm sorry, because I want you to keep going, but I just want, because I want your thoughts on this one. So black box, we say, is unallocated, undistributed. But we have a different problem, which is incorrectly associated. So when the wrong musical work is associated with the recording, and so the wrong parties are being paid. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, and that happens more like, I remember a publisher saying, or even with the IPI, when people use, when organizations, CMOs, pay out to the name and not the IPI. So was one publishing company that said they kept getting the Jack Johnson in Hawaii's money because they had not the most unusual name, a Jack Johnson signed to them, and they claimed we're sending it back. Obviously, you cannot go on names because there's how many hellos are there, and I think the second part of fixing this. And this is just, since we're talking about the MLC, and I just wanted to make sure that we get this in, is the people I would say the person who cares the most about my catalog, the person who knows the most about my catalog is me,
The songwriter.
the songwriter. I was in the room when that song was created. I know more than my publisher and whatever. When it comes to the MLC, and I'm not saying they're the only ones, but if we want to create something that is really useful, I can't become a member of the MLC because I'm published.
Well, let's clarify. So the MLC, its members are publishers,
Yeah.
not.
Or songwriter.
Or if your songwriter is not published.
Well, hang on, because I think we have to make that distinction. A songwriter that is identified as a songwriter is not a member. A publisher is a member. A songwriter can have a publishing entity and be that publisher, but really, it's very clear that only a publisher is able to, or administrator,
Yeah.
or rights manager is able to get into that portal and do stuff.
Yeah.
So let me
And it's-
ask the question.
Can I just?
If you,
yeah.
well, if you, I think I know where you're going with it. So if you're signed to a publishing company 10 years ago, and you're trying to get paid today, and you're no longer signed to that publisher, and you want to try to fix a mistake that's in the MLC database, will they talk to you as a songwriter, or do you have to get your old publisher to talk to them in
You
order
have
to
to-
fix that data?
You have to go back to your old publisher.
And they're
So
just
this is
waiting
the
for your call, right?
Yeah, they're waiting for my
sitting by
call.
the
Like
phone.
when one of my and I've been and it might not I might not even have ever been signed to them because my catalog might have been bought by somebody else or another publisher. So I have never had a relationship with that publishing company. And unless I'm like the Max Martins of this world, or at a very high level, they're really not going to be interested. So I think it's created in a way that doesn't adjust for what the reality is for a songwriter. I would say the majority of professional songwriters have had multiple publishers through the years, and those publishers might have been scooped up by other publishers and catalogs moving back and forth, and I think there's got to be a way where we can go in, and I know that someone you were telling me is pushing for this at the MLC, where it doesn't mean that we can go in and change things, because that would be crazy, But right now, the only people that can go in and claim things are mainly fraudsters, because they're the only ones that have
publishers.
nothing.
Publishers are the ones who can go in and claim.
Yeah, publishers, fraudulent publishers. But because if you create your own little publishing company and because the MLC is open to the public and you say, oh, this hasn't been claimed and that hasn't been claimed, you can go in and claim it. And me as a songwriter, if I'm actually the one that should be claiming it, I have to go to whoever that publisher was that I was signed to at that particular time. So it's very difficult to fix bad data for the actual songwriters. I think that we should be able to, and this has always been my thing, first of all, get a ping when there's a mismatch in one of my songs. Secondly, for me to be able to go in and say, this is the correct one. Can the other entities in this song, mark green or red? Yes, that's true. And we can all fix this particular registration. Right now, it is such a kind of convoluted way of
It's
trying
inefficient.
to fix it.
It's inefficient. We aren't giving alerts generally. I will have to give the shout out to SoundExchange with its overclaim dispute portal, which does ping you, actually. We receive an email when there is an overclaim or dispute. PRS does the same. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, we're banging on the MLC, and there are problems there for sure. I mean, I've looked into the MLC metadata pretty deeply, and there are very, very few ISWCs that are linked with ISRCs. And but I want to say I'm signed to MCPS PRS and have been since the early 70s, and I recently put out a 5 CD box set, and apart from a brief period in 1982 where we had a publishing deal with Sunbury Music, we've owned our publishing the whole time, and we own it again now. And when we went in to release this 5 CD box set, our publishing information was completely screwed up. There were publishers all over our songs that we never had anything to do with. So it's a really universal problem. It's not just the MLC. And I think part of the problem is that, the music industry in general is pretty backwards in terms of technology, in my opinion. But the publishing industry is even worse than the recorded music industry in that regard, in my experience. And I think we really need to embrace technology and solve the problem.
I want to try to characterize it in two different places. We have a back catalog problem on the metadata, but we also have to get proactive for the future, and try to solve for the future as well as try to clean up for the back catalog. And we introduced several years ago a tool called MDX, where at a pre-release level, the label and the publishers would get the link set up, and that has been working in the U.S. for people that are interested, as Abby said, to get that link set up at the very beginning. You've heard Graham and Helienne talk about ISWC, and the UK IPO office is working on a proof of concept to do the same, and we're engaged in those conversations as well. And I think the other big hurdle that had to get passed was getting a provisional ISWC, because at the beginning you had to have every single detail of the before the ISWC was given, and the recording's out there, the song's already out there. So making those strides on getting the provisional, we still want to get to the preferred so we don't lose the back catalog of all the detail. But I think we have to really start exploring how to make sure at the pre-release level this data is ready and set so that it can get out to the world.
So
I
when
think,
you talk,
can I,
just so people understand what the
that's exactly what I'm
difference
getting
is.
at, yeah. What is a provisional ISWC, and how does, who assigns it, how does it work? And then what is the preferred ISWC you referred to? Sorry.
Well, no, you go. I've been talking so much.
No, go ahead. You can get, with certain amount of information, which I won't have all the details, you can get the provisional assigned. You don't have to have every share of the song sorted out at the beginning, which was the criteria to begin with. So now a provisional will get sorted, issued with a limited set of data to allow there to be the link right away, and to propagate that in the industry from that standpoint. Eventually, you still want to get to a point where all of the share sets are known for that particular work, to get that to graduate to a preferred. So that can now happen over time, versus that was a precursor to even be able to establish that link if you were trying to do it from an ISWC and an ISRC level.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting with that too, and the reason why this happened is because there are a lot of independent and kind of creators that have come into the industry that actually don't belong to a collecting society. And as a songwriter, you get your IPI from your collecting society. And for example, in the UK, it costs £100 to join, and some of the, in particular in some genres, they don't want to join. So should all the other writers on a work not be paid because one writer does not want to join a CMO? And this was what we brought to the metadata working group, that it has to have some flexibility with that. So now with the provisional, you're able to get an ISWC as long as one of the writers has an IPI and is connected to a CMO.
Okay, but it's my understanding, so you can get that, let's actually also, so CISAC, there was this working group, right? PRS, I think, they did the proof of concept with this ISWC allocation service. Because what's been happening before now is, as a publisher or a writer, I had to register my work at a PRO in order to obtain this ISWC. Record labels, distributors, had been distributing sound recordings without having an associated ISWC. To resolve this problem, the POC, this group created this ISWC allocation service, which allowed, or is intended to allow, the sound recording side to ask for an ISWC. It's provisional, right? The whole idea is we're saying we got to know the ISRC and the ISWC. If we don't know both of them, we can't get everybody paid. So this is a first step, right? So now we have this allocation service that allows the record side, the recording side, to get the ISWC. But, and that's, as Helienne said, whether or not parties are known, period, and whether or not they have IPIs. But you can't get that preferred ISWC until all of the IPIs are known. So if somebody is outside of the CISAC PRO system and does not have an IPI, there isn't going to be an automatic move from provisional to preferred.
So now, good thing nobody's confused, right? Should we? Do we have any questions? I'm almost scared to ask. Do we have any questions? Anybody? No? Yes, Susan.
I think we need to.
Yeah.
What about the ISNI? I thought that was an up-and-coming identifier that was going to solve some of these problems. I'm not even sure what problem it's supposed to solve, but
I don't know how that will
it's
solve
supposed to
it.
be an up-and-coming identifier.
I mean,
Getting
you know,
another identifier. It's great that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good identifier because it identifies you across many different areas of the industry. So, for instance, I write books, I write songs, I'm an artist, and so an ISNI. So I went and applied for an ISNI almost pretty much right when ISNI started up, and I have my ISNI. Unfortunately, at this point, I now have 5 ISNIs. So I don't know why I have 5 ISNIs, but somebody's allocated 4 more to me. So this is the problem with our whole identifier system, is it's completely unregulated. It's the same with the ISRC. I mean, anybody can make up an ISRC. I mean, there was one distributor that decided to make up their own country code, or the first 2 letters, which are supposed to be US. I won't say who it is, but it really messed things up. So, I think ISNI is a good thing, definitely, but I don't see it solving any problems. I don't know if you agree or disagree, but
I just barely know any creators that have or know what an ISNI is.
yeah.
So and where would you put that ISNI in the end? I mean, I know, but I don't think that it's known well enough around the industry. And I think it's a good concept, but I think it's not going to solve our current issues yet, at least.
I mean, to point Abby was making before, looking into the MLC data, which is incredibly valuable, the amount of mismatched titles is frightening. I mean, there are many ISRCs that have multiple ISWCs associated with them. Well, that's technically impossible. One record can only have one work associated with it, but you see it all over. There's many works associated with some, and even if there are 2, that's still not okay. So we just need to clean up the metadata we have. I think creating more identifiers is not the solution at this point. It's settling on the identifiers we have and actually using them in the proper way, the way they're intended to be used.
So I think we're going to call it there.
Thank you very
we're out
much,
of time?
everybody. What a
Wanna
great
thank the
panel.
panel.
Can you please thank our panel?